Hello and welcome. Today I'm going to be talking about Wolcen Lords of Mayhem and the new Bloodtrail update. I know I'm a few months late to this, but overall it doesn't seem to matter much because not that much has changed. Which in this case is not a good thing because there seem to be plenty of bugs that were introduced with Bloodtrail, and plenty of bugs from the original release that haven't yet been resolved. To give a little context here, I played Wolcen in Alpha when it was a very different game. It was much more of a Diablo-looking game with Path of Exile style mechanics. Then, moving into the beta, they went with more of a Warhammer 40k look, and changed up the gameplay a lot. Then finally, the game released, and it was, to put it generously, a dumpster fire. They essentially pulled a No Man's Sky where they promised the world and failed to deliver even a working game. This, I believe, was in large part because, during the alpha and during the beta, they refused to allow players to test past Chapter 1, claiming it would spoil their story. I can't tell you much about this story, even though I've played through the game several times now, because it is extremely forgettable and annoying to deal with, and best left skipped, which is one of the worst parts about Bloodtrail. You have to go through the story again. Now, in a game like Path of Exile, I can understand leveling through the acts, because it introduces game mechanics and how skills work as you go. For a game like Wolcen, where the story is completely disconnected from most game mechanics, it would be far better to allow a skip or an adventure mode, much like Diablo 3 has. Because to be completely honest, I never cared about the stories of the characters. They were cliché and I couldn't get invested in them. I just wanted to go back to killing enemies as fast as possible, and there is no skip all button. So now, over a year after the game's released, what has changed, and did Bloodtrail redeem Wolcen? Well, in a word, no. But before I go any further, I'd like to say I don't think the devs are malicious here. I think that they really do want to make a good game. They're just making a lot of mistakes while trying to actually do it. I don't think this was a cash grab. I don't think this was an attempt at making a throwaway game, getting a bunch of money and making something else. It really feels like they're trying to make the game better, but it also feels like they're not communicating properly, and in their attempt to make it better and add new content, they're failing to fix fundamental issues that are going to cause far more damage and turn more people away than the new content could ever bring in. And before I start talking about my criticisms and breaking down the content, what I think is good and what I think is bad, I do think Wolcen is a bad game in its current form. It's also totally okay to like bad games. A game is not good just because you like it, and you can like a game in spite of it being bad. So what was added to Wolcen with Bloodtrail? And is it good? To start with, the first thing that was added was the new mechanic of hunts. Hunts kind of work like abysses in Path of Exile, where you follow a trail as you go through content, and you need to track down a super powerful rare monster at the end. Along the way, you're given a series of choices. You can choose to take certain rewards immediately, fight extra enemies, or make the final boss stronger. Overall, this is pretty good, and it's a good addition to the game. My only complaints are, number one, I didn't encounter it that much during the story, so I kind of forgot about it for a while. And number two, sometimes the trails go off to the sides of areas, and it feels really inefficient to go after the hunt rather than just powering through, speedrunning, and getting to the end of the area, most likely because the endgame is so repetitive and grindy. This is kind of one of the same problems that causes players to skip abysses in Path of Exile as well. If you're clearing a map from, let's just say, left to right, and the abyss goes right to left, you don't want to waste your time following the abyss, you want to get to the end of your map and get onto the next map, and get onto the next abyss that'll hopefully go in the right direction. And with this, they added a new Chronicle, which is similar to a Path of Exile League or a Diablo season. Now, I'm glad that they are adding new content with the Chronicles. However, I'm not so happy about logging into my now legacy character and seeing a tooltip like this. What in the world is that supposed to mean? The item is unbalanced or malfunctioning. Does this mean some of my items may be bugged and just not working? Which, speaking of bugs, there are plenty. For example, after I reallocated some stat points, the game just seemed to forget about my stats, and it was constantly bouncing back and forth between not remembering and remembering my stats, which is why I'm stuck at around 6k health, despite the fact that I should have 9. But it seems like I'm constantly missing and gaining a chunk of health here. And I've also encountered enemies several times that are just randomly floating in the air and can't really be attacked, or have otherwise managed to go out of bounds. In fact, a few times, after doing a zone, if there were some low-level enemies that I just kind of left behind me and ignored, they would come into the town to attack me in the town, which was a bug that was known about on release, but really should be fixed over a year later. Bloodtrail also adds pets. The pets are largely useless and slightly annoying because you will command your pet to pick up the item, but your character will not be able to pick up the item as you are commanding the pet to go get it. So if you click on an item by mistake when you're trying to move, you won't actually be able to move until you click again. There are some new buildings, but that leads me into my big problem with the whole rebuilding Stormfall, especially for League or seasonal content. It's a massive grind, and it's a massive slog, and a lot of the costs are so high that it doesn't feel particularly rewarding to be rebuilding it. I did it once on my main character, and I have very little desire to do it again. And it's made harder by the fact that I have to click on every building individually to know if I can even afford the next upgrade. Because there's no way for me to mouse over the building at a glance, see that, oh, I need 500,000 gold for that, and my measly 40 or 50,000, because I just got to Endgame, won't be enough. So this leads to a lot of pointless clicking. If you're going to have Chronicles, I think it's totally fine to have Chronicle characters, but if Stormfall gets reset with every Chronicle, and Chronicles come out regularly, let's just say every 3 months, like with Path of Exile, a lot of casual players are going to feel left out and left behind, because they never get to the point where they can fully unlock the systems before it just resets again. Now, it could be argued that the problem with that is if you don't fully reset it, veteran players will have a massive advantage over anyone new coming into the game. And that is a concern, so the midway balance would probably be to make the unlocks less grindy and reset it every time. If I could go through and comfortably unlock most of the things I need from the city without having to grind all the gold out and without having to spend the primordial essence that I'd rather use to level up my skills, the gold that I'd rather use to reforge sockets so that I can use new drops or possibly swap gems around, then it would be a lot easier for me to justify having to redo it with each new Chronicle. A massive revamp to skills, active modifiers, and increased build diversity, including a revamp to the Gate of Fates, was also advertised as part of a Bloodtrail update. Now, the ability to convert weapon damage into elemental damage on every skill is great. This is a good change, and it does make a lot more skills usable, and it gives you several options that synergize well with your gear so that actually stacking damage bonuses can now be relevant. This is all good. What's not so good is a lot of the modifiers don't appear to have tooltips. For example, now, it could be that this is just a bug, and they're all supposed to have tooltips, but it also means that it's impossible to make a choice as to which modifier I actually want, and which modifier actually helps my build. At the very minimum, there should be tooltips showing all of the values. Some of the mechanical behaviors I can understand being a little bit harder to classify, and that you might have to just play with the skill. But for something like increases damage per ailment on the enemy, how much damage? Just show the number. For increasing crit damage, just show the number. Which brings me to my second problem with the revamp to active skill modifiers. And that is that there's still a lot of very pointless ones. Something that just says, increase weapon damage by 15%. I mean, cool, your skill hits harder, but that's not really a choice you're making to add build diversity. It's just making it slightly better. And the way I see active skill modifiers is they should be changing the mechanics of the skill to make it more usable or more customizable, or changing the element of a skill so that it fits better into your build. If you just want flat numerical increases, you should be going to the Gate of Fates for that, as there's a lot of nodes in the Gate of Fates that have flat numerical increases. There's nothing new, different, or interesting. There's no one who says, oh, well, because this skill does 15% more weapon damage, it's now usable. It wouldn't be usable without that. Someone might say, oh, because this ground-targeted AoE skill can now be cast on me and move with me, I'll use it when otherwise I wouldn't. And so something like that for Bulwark of Dawn is great. Just doing damage, it's not so great. It kind of reminds me of when, at the beginning of 3.13, GGG said that they had 40 reworked gems, And as it turns out, there was maybe 3 interesting things and a bunch of other things got a 2% numbers pass that no one really cared about. Which brings me to the Gate of Fates, a system which is supposed to encourage build diversity because you can rotate rings to make your own custom class. And in theory, this is great. But right now, in practice, it actually encourages build homogeny because certain nodes are objectively stronger and weaker than others. So what this means is, regardless of what weapon or skill you use, most builds will go after certain nodes. A good example of this is rage builds go after Child of Fury to take Furious Appetite. This transforms your willpower regeneration into rage regeneration, so that instead of constantly draining your rage, you're constantly generating it, which allows you to actually play your build more smoothly. And I'm going to take a little bit of a diversion here to talk about another problem that Wolcen has had since release, and actually had since beta, that remains unresolved, which is resource management feels really bad in the early game, and it smooths out very easily by endgame. The problem with this is, a new player who has a first impression of a game is more likely to have a negative impression of a resource system than a positive one. By the time I get to around level 60, I can easily sort it out by taking Furious Appetite or stacking willpower regeneration or whatever I need to do. But when I'm level 25 or 35, I often struggle to balance the resources and find it needlessly annoying. You never want players to have a very bad first impression that gets better later, because most people will never see the it gets better later part. They'll just leave your game. And back to the Gate of Fates. Another good example of this is the assassin node Merciless Lethality, because it gives such a large bonus to crit damage. If you're going crit, you want to take this. So instead of having the option to choose between this area or that area and rotating things around, what you're really doing is you're rotating to get the highest concentration of powerful nodes, because that's what your build needs, and there's too many nodes in the Gates of Fate that are generically powerful, and not enough that are synergistically powerful. So Merciless Lethality, if you crit, is good. End of story. It doesn't require any other setups or synergies. On the other hand, the Kabbalist node Immortal Offering is synergistically powerful. You can get a massive amount of bonus damage out of Immortal Offering, but to do so you have to specialize in dealing an entire rainbow of damage, and it's pretty hard to set that up between gear and skills. So it's a node that only really shines when your build really invests into it, and it allows you to invest into something different and rewards you for it. Nodes like Immortal Offering drive build diversity, and I'd like to see a lot more of those, rather than the generically powerful stuff that takes up so much of the Gate of Fates. And if you like in-depth analysis of game systems or games in general, or if you're looking for gameplay guides, subscribe to my channel. So finally, the endgame of Wolcen as a whole. Now, the endgame was its weakest part. Things like this legendary map should be fun and exciting. It should be like Vault of Atziri in Path of Exile, or entering the Vault in Diablo 3. But instead it's, well, really underwhelming. And underwhelming describes a lot of Wolcen's endgame right now. I realize they're a small team, and I realize that games like Diablo and Path of Exile have years of content behind them. But the variance in Wolcen's endgame is simply too low for how grindy it is. In Path of Exile, you're able to move up map tiers as you feel your build is able to challenge them. You could be doing tier 1 maps and say, hey, tier 1 maps really aren't challenging me. I'm going to get together these tier 1 maps and vendor them together into a tier 2, and vendor the tier 2s into a tier 3. And now all of a sudden, you've jumped to tier 3 maps, which are a better challenge for your character. In Diablo, you're allowed to pretty freely set the difficulty of the content that you do. And this allows you to progress in something that feels like a challenge to your character, but not a complete waste of time because it's way too easy or way too hard. The expeditions in Wolcen do not allow this freedom. Yes, you can go down if it's too hard, but you can't go up. To solve this, what I think they need to do is allow you to unlock 9 levels above whatever you're currently doing. So if I do a level 87 expedition, that's 87, 88, and 89. I should also unlock the 90 to 92 and 93 to 95. This way, I'm able to challenge content more at a pace my character can handle, rather than having to grind and slog through levels that don't feel particularly challenging and don't feel particularly rewarding. It's this aspect that really puts me off of trying to further progress in Wolcen, especially with things like Chronicle content. There just isn't enough to do. And this certainly isn't helped by the fact that there's relatively few different enemy types, relatively few bosses, and relatively few tile sets for the endgame expeditions. So it really does feel like you're just doing the same thing over and over and over and over and over again. Now, luring Untainteds is a fun way to break this up, and I really enjoy doing Untainteds. If I could, I would do them all the time. The problem is, it costs Primordial Essence, and it doesn't actually advance the level of content you're able to do. If I do a level 87 Untainted, even if I get an S+ ranking, I don't unlock level 90. I'm just stuck doing level 87 Untainteds until I decide to go back to grinding the far more boring content and pushing those levels, which is slow, painful, and again feels far less rewarding than just doing more Untainted runs. None of this was helped by the fact that in my play sessions, I crashed every 3 hours or so. I'm not sure if it's a memory leak or other issues with the game, but it definitely was not very stable. Also, a lot of the time it would lag significantly whenever a boss would load in, whenever a hunt monster would load in, or whenever I was opening a new instance. These things were all issues at launch, and they really should have been optimized out of the code by now. Then finally, the combat. Combat in Wolcen is so hit or miss. Some skills, like Infinity Blades, feel amazing, and playing that skill definitely kept me interested in the game for longer than I would have been otherwise. On the other hand, things like some of the apocalyptic form dashes, or Bladestorm, feel absolutely god-awful. There's such an inconsistency in skills and skill animations in what feels good and what feels very clunky because the animation lasts too long and you're locked into too specific of a motion. Enemy knockbacks similarly feel terrible, and there's very few ways to mitigate them, which means you just kind of have to put up with it. And the problem with this is, especially as enemies get higher and higher health pools relative to your damage, this makes the game feel even more boring and more grindy, which demotivates people from wanting to progress further. Now, the last thing I want to touch upon is the crafting system. The crafting system should be an intrinsic part of the endgame, but I didn't use it nearly as much as I wanted to, or nearly to the potential I wanted to, because a year in, it's still bugged. Now, whenever you use an entropy orb, which is totally not just a chaos orb from Path of Exile, if you have gems in the item, you should be able to use the gem to influence a mod that's added to the item, a way to give yourself deterministic crafting so the item might not be perfect, but it will always have something you want on it, much like an essence in Path of Exile. In theory, this is a great system, and in theory, being able to see the outcomes is also cool. In practice, both are pretty useless, because I used a toxic gem there, and I didn't get any toxic-related modifiers. Also, even though you can see all the outcomes, you can't see the odds of getting a specific outcome, so you still have to go to an external source to look up your odds of getting a crafting outcome, which means the information might as well not be displayed. The fix to both of these problems is quite simple. The first fix would be make gems actually work. Clearly some of them are bugged, others work. I've had times where I can roll items with the gems, and times where it just doesn't do anything. So whatever that bug is, fix it or clarify the tooltip where it's, let's just say, a 30% chance, in which case the system should probably just be changed to 100% anyway. In the case of not showing the odds, just show the odds. People are going to know them, people are going to data mine them, you might as well just leave them transparent. So in closing, is Wolcen better now than it was on release? Yes. Should you play it? If you already own it and you're really bored, maybe, but don't go into it with high hopes. Should you buy it? You absolutely shouldn't buy it. It's not a $40 game. It's not even a $20 game in its current form. There's too many bugs, there's not enough communication from the developers, and it's hard to see a bright future for this game when it can't maintain a player base because over a year after release, core issues still haven't been resolved. As much as I'd like to say that Bloodtrail was what the game needed, and as much as it is a step in the right direction, less needs to be done right now about adding new content, more needs to be done about putting the game back into beta and fixing all the bugs, then adding new content and re-releasing the game when it's actually in a proper releasable state. This probably won't be my last video on the game, because I do really want it to end up being good someday. I want it to be No Man's Sky, where it's bad for 5 years and then has a redemption story. But at this point, I am losing some hope of that. I feel it's most likely just going to fade into obscurity or end up being another Anthem where it gets cancelled entirely after it's clearly unsustainable. So my question to you is, have you played Wolcen after Bloodtrail was added? And if so, how do you feel about the game? Do you feel it has improved enough to be worth your time to play? Or do you feel it has so many issues that it simply isn't worth the bother at this point, and might be better in the future, or may never improve? I'd love to hear your thoughts down in the comments below. I'd love to hear if you'd like me to talk about more bad or struggling games, and some of the reasons why they're bad or why they struggle. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video. And special thanks to all of my channel members who help support me so that I can continue to make videos just like this one. Your support really means a lot, and without it, I probably wouldn't be able to make videos this regularly. If you want to help support the channel, click the membership button or the link down in the comments below. And if you found this video helpful and want to ask me a question in a more interactive setting, I stream at least once a week here on YouTube, and I'd be happy to answer any questions you have relating to this video or any of my other videos. Thank you again, and I hope to see you on stream sometime. Have a great day.